Let's begin with a prayer, in fact. So, I always like to do that, especially at a Catholic place, before giving a talk. But before I do that, I have an announcement, and that is I have a handout for this talk. Frank said, I'm one of you, and I used to be a teacher, so I am not one of you. I did, because of that, I provided a handout. So if you go to my website, if you're interested, if you want a handout, it's there at michaelmathesonmiller.com. I'll trust that you're not checking the Drudge Report and that you're actually following along with the handout. But some people like handouts, it's helpful, so if you like it, there it is. It'll be right on the front on the blog at michaelmathesonmiller.com. Let us pray. Highest, most glorious God, cast your light into the darkness of our hearts. Give us right faith, firm hope, perfect charity, with wisdom and perception, that we might do what is truly your holy will. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Concern for the poor is at the heart of Christianity. Care for the poor is not an option. It's not something that we can say, well, I'm interested in liturgy and moral philosophy. You take care of poverty. In fact, all of us are called to care for the poor. St. James, in his epistle, summarizes in many ways the gospel message when he writes, "Pure religion is this, to care for the widow and the orphan in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained from the world." So we're called to be in the world, but not of the world. Now notice, in a lot of modern interpretations, want to choose one or the other. We want to be either have care for the widow and the orphan in their distress, so in social justice, or we want to be unstained from the world. But St. James says, no, they both are needed. So it's not enough just to keep ourselves unstained for the world if we don't care for the widow and the orphan. But it's not enough to care for the widow and the orphan if we become tainted by the world, if we become tainted by the spirit of the age. So this is a hard thing to do, but this is the challenge that the gospel sets out in front of us. We also know that almsgiving is one of the eminently good works, and to ignore the plight of the poor has terrible consequences for our eternal souls. The readings today in Mass, for those of you who are there, stress the importance of the generous man lends. He cares for the poor. Pope Francis wrote in Evangelii Gaudium, quote, he says, almost without being aware of it, we end up being incapable of feeling compassion at the outcry of the poor, as though this were someone else's responsibility and not our own. The culture of prosperity deadens us. We are thrilled if the market offers us something new to purchase, he says. But in the meantime, all those lives stunted for lack of opportunity seem a mere spectacle. They fail to move us. Now, this problem is clearly seen, of course, in the parable we all know of Lazarus and the rich man. I have a picture of it up. St. Augustine, commenting on this passage, said, it was not wealth that sent the rich man to hell, nor, because we just heard Frank Hanna talk, was it all of his money. Okay? It wasn't wealth or money that sent the rich man to hell. It was his indifference. He just didn't care. He ignored the poor man. God had put in front of him this opportunity to serve, to get his salvation, as it were. It was a gift. The poor man was a gift, and the rich man ignored Lazarus. As St. John Chrysostom and other church fathers have argued, commenting on this passage and other places, care for the poor is also not just a question of charity, it's also a question of justice. So we are called to care for the poor. This is an essential element of our faith. But we are not called just to do something. Not called just to do something. We are not simply called to exercise our will on behalf of poor people. Do you remember the bumper sticker many years ago that said, "Practice random acts of kindness"? Remember that bumper sticker? Well, Christians are not called to practice random acts of kindness. We are endowed with reason, with logos, We are created in the image of God, and we are called to perform acts of charity ordered by reason and oriented to truth. As Pope Benedict wrote in Caritas in Veritate, only in truth does charity shine forth. Only in truth can charity be authentically lived. Without truth, charity degenerates into sentimentality. End quote. This means that our charity and our desire for justice must be rooted in the virtue of prudence. Now, the great Joseph Pieper, has anyone read the works of Joseph Pieper? Okay, good. He's great. For those of you who haven't, you're lucky because you get to read the works of Joseph Pieper. Pieper defines prudence as seeing the world as it is and acting accordingly. All right? Now, I want you to think about that. Prudence, seeing the world as it is and acting accordingly. First of all, you're business people, most of you. And that's an important virtue for business people, because if you don't see the world as it is and acting accordingly, you go out of business. Right? So what is prudence? Now, we tend to think of prudence as kind of being careful. Most of us in this room are old enough to remember the comedian Dana Carvey doing an imitation of George H.W. Bush. He'd be like, not going to do it. Wouldn't be prudent. Not going to do it. Okay? Thank you. I have never been prudent in all of my life. I don't even know what that word means, and if I did, I would not want it. Okay? All right. Appreciate you guys. Appreciate your being here. Appreciate prudence. I love it. It's unbelievably huge. Okay? Believe me, when I say prudence is big, it is the mother of all the virtues. Okay? That's what St. Thomas, a great, great guy from Aquinas, said. It is the mother of the virtues, okay? Believe me. Now, why is prudence the mother of the virtues? Because you can't be just, you can't be temperate, right? You can't be charitable, you can't be kind, unless you see the world as it is and act accordingly. And that's why justice, truth, and charity are related. I found actually a wonderful quote a quote not too long ago from Thomas Aquinas, who wrote, and listen, think about this, it's powerful. Justice can be destroyed, he says, in two ways. By the violent act of the man who possesses power, and by the false prudence of the sage. Now, we get the first part, the bad guy, Plato's Thrasymachus, right, who says justice is the right of the stronger, I'll do what I want. But we don't think about the second one, the false prudence of the sage, the policymaker, the bureaucrat, the social engineer, the charity, the do-gooder, that actually, through imprudent charity, causes injustice. There's a rock star named Bob Geldof. He's done a lot for raising awareness about poverty, and his passion is quite commendable. But he said once, we have to do something about poverty. We have to do something, even if it doesn't work. Now, notice for a second. He's assuming that the thing he's going to do is either going to help or be neutral, and is forgetting the third option, that his help might actually make the situation worse. He might actually increase injustice with his charity. So it's clear, we must have a heart for the poor. We are called to help the poor. But we are also called to have a mind for the poor and to engage with them as persons and not simply as things, as I'll talk about it later. So in this lecture, I want to consider three things. First, we're going to briefly examine the dominant approach to charity and social justice, and I'll argue that it has not been as helpful or beneficial as was hoped. Just mentioned the film Poverty, Inc. If we address a lot of these things in that film, if you're interested, you can see it. Second, I'll discuss some of the underlying theological and philosophical problems with the current model. And third, I'll argue that the biggest obstacle for today's poor is not that they lack material goods, but they are excluded. They are excluded from the institutions of justice, like clear title to land, ability to participate in the formal economy and get their court case heard, things we take for granted. They are excluded for them. And so if they had these things, not necessarily material goods, but this access to institutions of justice, they would be able to create prosperity in their own families and their own communities. So let's begin with part one, which is the major social justice response to poverty. Now, at the end of World War II, and the breakup of colonialism, the dominant idea was that if we could transfer large sums of money from governments in developed economies like the United States to build up infrastructure, electricity, and education, we could develop poor countries and they could make the leap to industrialism. Now, these ideas came out of the context of World War II. The idea, well, we've won the war, let's win the peace. Let's use massive social engineering plans to build up economies. But as time has passed, this has developed really into kind of an industry. And I'm not going to explain all of this graph, but there's a lot of people in the industry. And what's happened, unfortunately, is like many other industries, like your industries, the goal of the poverty industry has become to stay in business. All right? Now, there's a lot of things going on that I'm only going to touch upon. Large-scale foreign aid, non-governmental organizations, and a host of things. So let me just go through a couple of them and talk about some of the ways that we try to help the poor and some of what I would call our imprudent actions of charity. Foreign aid is this idea of government-to-government transfers. These are massive transfers in the United States to, say, a country in sub-Saharan Africa or the United Nations or the World Bank, these big loans, right? Now, there have been some individually successful ones, right? For example, some of the early response to the tsunamis or earthquakes can be very helpful because in an emergency situation, you need immediate help. But I've done it, my colleagues and I did close to about 200 interviews for the projects we worked on, and several people from Africa, Latin America, and Asia offered some insights into some of the problems that come with foreign aid. Senegalese businessman Malik Fall put it this way. He said, aid has delayed the development of business in Africa. It has kept Africa behind. Why? Because when aid is given, it can often replace or crowd out local businesses. Even worse, aid becomes linked with business and crony capitalism and feeds this type of crony capitalism where big business, powerful interest groups, and entrenched political bureaucracies collude with one another for advantages and lock out smaller local businesses. I spoke to a Ghanaian entrepreneur from Ghana, West Africa. He has a small software company named Herman Chinere Hesse. And he told me a story. 5 companies, he said, got together to go to bid for a government project. And everything was going well. They were about to get the deal. And a foreign company got their country to give a soft loan to Ghana on the condition that that company's business got, that country's company got the business deal. So the Ghana said to Herman and his colleagues, he's like, look, we love you guys, but nothing beats free money. We got to go with the European company. Herman said, we lost our business. That's not aid. That's not assistance. He said, that's thuggery. Right? This is the type of crony capitalism that with good intentions mixed with that doesn't have prudence ends up hurting the very people we're trying to help. Let me give you another example with agriculture. Here's what we do to the developing world. In Europe and the United States, we subsidize our farmers to protect farmers. Okay? There's a debate whether we're protecting big agribusiness or farmers, but I'll leave that to the side for a minute. I will say that there's a farmer in Virginia who farms about 1,000 acres, I think, now, and he's an organic farmer, and he wrote a book called Everything I Want to Do is Illegal. Because he says, look, most of the rules aren't protecting farmers, they're protecting massive industries. But here's what we do, we protect those, then we overproduce, and then we ship our food as aid, or we sell it artificially cheaply, And we end up distorting the market and putting local farmers out of business. And then what do we do? Well, we say, oh my goodness, competition hurts the poor. And we blame free markets and we say we need regulation. And who do you think writes the regulation? Big, powerful interest groups. Right? This is not free competition. It's managerial crony capitalism. The Guardian newspaper reported that out of $1 billion in agricultural food aid in the United States, 70% went to 3 large companies. That's $700 million made on poverty. And so the question is, who's benefiting from our goodwill? And is our goodwill prudent? Now, foreign aid can be helpful and even necessary in great emergency, as I said. But this is short term. The problem is we've used foreign aid and the emergency situation as the model for development. As one person said, 3 years after the earthquake in Haiti, they were still giving away free rice. It's not an emergency anymore. And that's one of the problems, is sometimes we get moved by a sentimental situation. How many people have been to the developing world? Okay, do you remember the first time you went and you saw pretty intense poverty? And you see a leaky roof and a dirt floor, and you think, oh my goodness, I have to do something right now. It's an emergency. And it's true, it's an emergency for us. It's not an emergency for the people who live there. It's a chronic problem. And you don't solve chronic problems with emergency situations. And that's one of the big mistakes that we've done, because our charity has not been prudent. In some ways, the foreign aid model has become a foundation for a new type of colonialism. One person had said this way in Haiti. He said, first we had colonialism, then we had neo-colonialism, then we had neo-neo-colonialism, and now we just have development, which is another kind of colonialism. Now, before I move on, I want to talk about one more thing with foreign aid, which is a moral issue that I think you need to be aware of if you're not already. Beyond the problems of economics and justice, which I've discussed, there are other moral problems with foreign aid. Often aid grants or loans are made contingent upon morally evil things, most notably population control programs, and increasingly issues about homosexual marriage. Western nations and international organizations impose a Western secular Enlightenment worldview on developing nations, what Pope Francis has called ideological colonization. Now, this is seen in things like the Millennium Development Goals or the Sustainable Goals, which say we're going to improve maternal health. Well, improved maternal health also includes access to abortion and other what they call reproductive care. All right. Over the last decade, international organizations and Western governments have spent literally billions of dollars promoting population control throughout the developing world. Now, I'm going to pause here for a second to make you think. Most people use literally now to mean figuratively, right? Like, he literally ripped my face off, okay? I literally mean literally and not figuratively, okay? Like Andreas Widmer said that Frank was literally going to tear the house down, so I left. Okay? All right, so I mean literally. All right. So we literally have spent billions of dollars promoting population control, despite the fact there's no evidence that population causes poverty. People are not a burden. In fact, when given an opportunity, they can create more wealth than they consume. People are the solution to poverty, not a problem. We've bought into a number of things. One of them is the zero-sum game. Does everyone know what the zero-sum game is? That's the zero-sum game. All right? The zero-sum game is that the economy is a pie. This is a pizza pie. But that the economy is a pie, and that if you have more, then I have less. And if I have more, then you have less. And there's only so much to go around. And so all these people are taking things. And if you had fewer people, there'd be more things to go around. It also comes for the similar error of the first time you visit the developing world. See all these children, and they're around you, and they're asking you things. Oh, please, zapatos, por favor, can I have something? Can I have something? You think, and the people think, because they've been indoctrinated with the zero-sum game, that the economy is a pie, which it's not a pie. Economies can grow. The fact that we're all sitting here, that I flew here, that you can get coffee and talk on your mobile phones and check the handle that I told you and do all of these things is evidence that the economy can grow, that life expectancy can increase through economic growth. But we buy into this economic fallacy. And then we see all the children around and we think, oh, well, if there were fewer children, there'd be more things to go around. So we come up with benevolent policies like the Gates Foundation to promote birth control. And I don't know if you know this, but we don't just provide birth control. We actually sometimes sterilize and sometimes forcibly sterilize in addition to providing abortions. So it's this zero-sum game that people fall into. Now let me give you an example. Let me give you an example why the zero-sum game is a fallacy. Let's say, right now I said, okay, everybody stand up, take your money, and let's pool it right here in the middle of the room, okay? And then go sit down. Now we're going to divide the room in half, and we're going to eradicate this half of the room, all right? Feel your pain. I'm on this half too, okay? We are dead together. All right, so we're dead. Now we're going to take all the money from here, and we're going to redistribute it to everybody here. Is this side of the room richer, yes or no? Yes, of course it is. On a snapshot. It's true. But it's a fallacy because what we've forgotten is that we've now eradicated the productive capacity of this side of the room. So in the short term, the zero-sum game may be true, but in the long term, it's not. And so it's an economic fallacy. But it's also, more important, an anthropological fallacy. And that's a fallacy that we don't understand that it doesn't really matter if human beings can produce more than they consume. Human beings have a dignity and a value that is not determined by social engineers in Western bureaucracies. So this is a problem. But even though population control has not ended poverty, it's worked. Now, what do you mean? Wait, first of all, you told me it doesn't work, and now you tell me it does work. Well, it doesn't end poverty. But when you encourage people to have small families, and you pay billions of dollars, they do. And what kind of child do they choose? When you have a small family, what kind of child do you choose? You choose boys. You choose boys. And so now we have unprecedented boy-girl ratios. That's a result of what Nassim Taleb calls naive interventionism. It's social engineering. It's imprudent charity that causes injustice. We have unprecedented boy-girl ratios. We have what the New York Times has called the daughter deficit and what the Economist magazine has called gendercide. What happened to 100 million baby girls? And that's just India. It's not just China. It's not just India. It's throughout the world. You're seeing these effects. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's pause for a minute and think about imprudent charity causing injustice. When there are fewer girls, do they become precious and cared for? No, they become commoditized. And so we have just begun to see the effects of foreign aid and morally evil and economically fallacious programs that are causing incentives for a whole host of problems. When we play with complex systems, we usually have disastrous situation. And this is what we've done to the poor through imprudent charity. Now, let me move on and quickly just give some other examples. We have another thing called non-governmental organizations. So NGOs we tend to think of as small kind of private organizations. You probably have some here, right? In fact, I was over at the cathedral and at the high school and I've seen all the generosity that goes on. But notice it's relational generosity as opposed to like, hey, let's go help people far away. Not that you shouldn't help people far away, but notice that you're in relationship with the people you're helping here. Are we in relationship with the people we're helping in other places? It's a question to ask. Because these are complex things, and there's no simple solution, and good people can disagree. Poverty is a complex problem. So what I'm trying to do is help us think it through, right? But we have to wrestle with these things. So non-governmental organizations, we tend to think of them as small, but some of them are quite big. Okay, World Vision, for example, gets like some hundreds millions of dollars from, I think it's 150 million? I forget the number exactly, in their budget. Catholic Relief Services, since we're at a Catholic place, Catholic Relief Services gets about 70% of its money from the U.S. government. Now ask yourself a question. Is Catholic Relief Services therefore an arm of the church, or is it an arm of the state? Is it a parastate organization? And when you make a deal with the devil, you're usually the junior partner. Now, it's not intrinsically wrong to get money from the government, but I think it's not a prudent question, especially with the ratcheting of cultural socialism and just the proximity to certain morally evil issues, which, if you'd like me to give you more detail about, I can, but it's something to think about. Now, another example of NGOs, I was in Haiti, and this man, this is me, talking to this man called, I'm having a mind blank, Jean Ronel. Anyway, so, no. It's Alex George and his business partner, John Ronell. Alex was giving me a tour of his factory, and they make solar panels in Haiti. Now, first of all, how many people thought they could make solar panels in Haiti? It's always a surprise, because you think, wait a minute, they make solar panels in Haiti? I thought they were poor there. Right? And we have this image of poor people kind of just sitting there without any opportunity. Well, they're making solar panels in Haiti, and they were selling 50 streetlights a month. Okay, they're in the factory. I went to the factory. They're employing some people from some of the most dangerous places on the planet. Men who are fathers, and they're employing them to work in this factory. And they were selling 50 streetlights a month. Now, after the earthquake, demand for solar streetlights skyrocketed. And in the next 6 months, they sold 5 streetlights. Because all these NGOs came in and were giving them away. And they said, we can't compete with free. So instead of partnering, say, hey, you're a solar panel, let's work together, and we can buy some of your stuff. Instead, it was coming in and giving it for free. So again, are we partnering with people? How are we thinking about it? There's more things I could talk about. I'll give you a quick example of charity, and then I want to go to the theological parts and then talk about, I think, a different way of thinking about it. But let me give you another story that happened with charity. And this is an example that's really complex. But there was a couple that went down to Haiti to adopt a child. And they started working in an orphanage, and they thought they would start an orphanage. And so they were working down there, kind of learning about it, and they decided they were going to adopt a child. And just as they were about to adopt the child, the orphanage director said, would you like to meet the mother? I said, well, I didn't know the child had a mother. I thought he was abandoned. No, the mother comes like once a week and visits the child. And so they watch the mother with the child, and so obviously the mother loves him very much. So Shelley and Corrigan met with her and said, why are you giving up your child for adoption? She said, I can't afford him. And Shelley said, here was this shock. Like, here I am spending $20,000 to adopt a child that this mother wants. She said, and the injustice of it all just hit me. And so she didn't know maybe the theory of what she was doing. But Shelley started acting according to the principle of subsidiarity, which is a Catholic social teaching principle. And instead of focusing immediately on the child, she focused on families. And she and her husband, mostly she, but her husband started a business, just making beads and different various things. And now they employ, I'm scooping up here. Oh, I don't have it there. Okay, I thought I had a picture of that. Now they employ 220 workers. And they're caring for, quote unquote, over 700 children. Not through an orphanage, but actually creating the opportunity for parents to take care of their children. Because they discovered, and this is Haitian statistics too, that about 80% of orphans in Haiti have actually one living biological parent, which means they're not orphans, they're economic relinquishments. So in our response to the gospel call, which we must heed, to care for the widow and the orphan in their distress, we weren't thoughtful, and we created incentives for people to give up their children. And this is why we have to be in relationships and also keep prudence in the forefront of our mind. Now, what I want to do now is talk briefly about some of the underlying problems with the dominant model of the way we think about charity. One of the things that I want to say first is, and you're business people, and this is something even to challenge you. When you see a problem, what is an entrepreneur? Right, Frank's touched on this already, but what's an entrepreneur? An entrepreneur is someone who sees a problem and comes up with a solution to that problem. Peter Thiel in 0 to 1, he says, most of the time it's a company. Sometimes it's a nonprofit or a hospital or a school. Most of the time it's a company. John Paul, in his definition of business, says it's people who come together to solve problems for others and to meet their own needs. Right? And Frank's point about it's supplying and providing value for other people. Now, it's very interesting, however, that all the many entrepreneurs, not all, but many entrepreneurs who are incredibly entrepreneurial when it comes to their own societies, when we go and think about how we're going to help the poor, we stop thinking entrepreneurially and we start thinking like, oh, well, what can I provide? Well, you wouldn't do that here. Why would you do it there? So here's some of the underlying theological and philosophical problems. Okay, I would argue one of the biggest problems is that the dominant idea of how we engage with the poor is in fact not charity. It is humanitarianism. Now, they appear the same, but humanitarianism is a hollowed out secular form of charity. And charity, we know, comes from the Latin word caritas and means Christian love. Now, Christian love is what? What is the definition of love? The definition of love is to seek the good of the other. The Latin is the intentio benevolentia, this intentional desire for the benevolence of the other person. The great Joseph Pieper says, to say I love you is to say it is good that you are, and then to affirm your being and to seek for your flourishing, that you would flourish as a human person. So the goal of charity is to promote human flourishing while always keeping the eternal destiny in mind. But humanitarianism, on the other hand, is more focused on the immediate and providing comfort. It has limited horizons. It doesn't see past the immediate. It doesn't see past providing comfort. It stops. Now, do we need to provide comfort? Of course, but we don't stop there. We focus on human flourishing and always keeping the eternal destiny in mind. So this is why humanitarianism can say, oh, well, let's sterilize women. Let's not have births. Because human flourishing doesn't matter. Wealth, the way that Frank talked about it, doesn't matter. Money matters. Material goods matter. But charity says human flourishing matters. And life with God matters. And being is better than non-being, and being is more important than having. But that's not what humanitarianism believes. So, as Benedict XVI reminds us, as I quoted before, without truth, charity degenerates into sentimentality. And the first truth we need is the truth about the human person and truth about what it means to love. Because we have this faulty notion of humanitarianism, we're always asking what we can do. What can I do? What can I do? What can I do? But the better question is, what do people need to be able to create prosperity in their own families and communities? And then how can I come alongside to help them? Now, that's the first, is humanitarianism. The second philosophical and theological problem is also related to that, is that we have turned poor people into objects. We have turned poor people into objects of our charity, objects of our pity, and objects of our compassion, instead of seeing them as the subjects and protagonists of their own story of development. We treat people like things, and then we adopt a social engineering model to deal with them. Now, how many of you read John Paul II's Love and Responsibility? Carol Wojtyła, Love and Responsibility. Okay. So, in many ways, that's what I'm talking about. If you read it, you understand this is what I'm talking about. That we treat people like objects instead of subjects. Now, by subjects, I don't mean subjects of the king. I mean subjects in a grammatical sense. So let me give you an analogy from Genesis and your own existential experience to help you think it through. In the beginning, God creates Adam, and he puts all the animals in front of Adam, if you remember, and he tells Adam to name the animals, right? So Adam names the animals. There's a lot going on theologically, but he names the animals. But he's unsatisfied. And God says it's not good for man to be alone. And so God puts Adam into a deep sleep, and from his rib, he creates Eve. And what does Adam say when he sees Eve? He says, at last, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. Now, Cardinal Scola, in his book, The Nuptial Mystery, says that what Adam is seeing is identity and difference. Identity, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, and difference, woman. And in that identity and difference is a call to communion. And the call to communion is sublime. And it's sublime in itself. But it's also sublime because from that call to communion comes another subject willed for his or her own sake. That is why a child is not a choice of the parents. That is why when you say, oh, a child is a gift from God, you're actually not being sentimental. It's an ontological reality. Because a child is a gift, because the child is a subject willed for his or her own sake to flourish as a human being and to live eternally with God. As C.S. Lewis says, you've never met a mere mortal. Civilizations, cultures, these are mortal. But it's immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit. Immortal horrors or everlasting splendors. That's what the subject is. So, you have this situation. Then tragedy takes place. Adam and Eve eat the fruit. They disobey God. And we all know about the sweat of the brow and how work, which comes before the fall, work is not a punishment for sin. Work is part of our original vocation, but then becomes difficult. But then God says this terrible thing to Eve. He says, you will desire your husband, and he will lord it over you. And so what happens is that the difference comes in front of the identity. And Adam turns Eve into an object for his use. And this, though with less gravity, is what we do to poor people. We let the difference of poverty, the difference of ethnicity or language come in front, and we objectify poor people, often for our own benefit. Just as we would objectify a man or a woman for sexual gratification and benefit, right? It's not only Frank who's going to talk about money and sex, all right? So, now, there is some hope, by the way, just throw this out, that in this identity and difference, this is what the gift of Christian marriage is. Christian marriage, through self-donative giving, helps return to what John Paul II calls the original unity of man and woman. Because by self-giving, the difference is pushed back where it belongs, in relationship to the identity. This is why traditionally marriage is called a remedy for concupiscence. Okay? Remember, concupiscence is the effects of original sin. It's like when St. Paul says, I do what I hate and I don't do what I want. Right? You know that feeling? We feel like we know we're going to do the right thing. You know you're going to do the right thing. I'm not going to say anything bad about her. I'm not going to say anything bad. Do you know what she did? Right? I'm not going to get angry. I'm not going to get angry. Get out of here. Okay? Right? And so we have this pressure. But marriage is a remedy for concupiscence. Now, again, I don't want to be overly earthy here, but it does not mean an outlet for horniness. It means a healing for this objectifying inclination that we have as a result of original sin. Right? And so this now, everyone existentially understands what I mean by objects and subjects. Now back to the poverty question. Again, this is how we treat, again with less gravity, poor people, like objects. Okay, and then once they're objects with sentimental humanitarianism, they become problems to be solved. Right? they become social engineering equations for international bureaucrats who are just going to maneuver and manipulate everything around, instead of human persons called to flourish. And this is where Catholicism has something to add. This is why it's very important that Catholics don't just sign on to the latest fashion. We're going to give shoes, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. Unfortunately, many Catholics do. I went to the University of Notre Dame, which is a good place to become a Protestant, and and I did, but I'm back, okay? I didn't really become a Protestant, almost. All right, anyway. So, but it's true. All right, signed on to like the United Nations Millennium Development Goals. You see people in the church saying, oh no, we really need to support these things. Like, well, wait a minute. Why don't we think differently? Why doesn't the church work? In addition to being the Holy Roman Catholic Church, we're also the largest and the most global institution in the world. Right? Why are we modeling a bad copy of ourselves? This is what humanitarianism is, a bad copy of Christian love. And sometimes we, and I say we, not you people, we imitate a bad copy of Christian love. So we have many things to bring to the table, and we should not be ashamed of that and to think about these things. So if you start thinking about Catholic social teaching and also the role of entrepreneurs, there are many things that we can bring to the table when it comes to helping and working with the poor as subjects and protagonists. So this leads me to the last part of my talk. One of the things Pope Francis has stressed is we must say no to an economy of exclusion and inequality. And one thing we hear often is if North American Christians or the United States or Europe were more generous, we could raise billions of dollars and we could eradicate extreme poverty forever. And the answer is no, we could not. Because poverty is not a result of lack of stuff. The reason that most people are poor throughout the world is not because they lack stuff, it's because they are excluded from the institution of justice. Why is it that entrepreneurs emerge in the United States or North Korea, but they don't emerge in most of sub-Saharan Africa? Is it because they're somehow radically different from us? Are we just smarter, better, balder, and more handsome? And that's why we're entrepreneurs? I would suggest the reason that there are entrepreneurs in the United States than there aren't entrepreneurs in other places is because of certain key institutions of justice that we take for granted that don't exist in the developing world. And these are things like clear title to land. There they are. Access to justice in the courts. Freedom of association and participation in the formal economy, freedom of exchange. Okay, I'm going to go over them quickly, and then there's obviously, this is a complex thing, but let me give you some examples of what I mean. In many countries throughout the world, 50 to 60% of the land has no clear title. If you do not know who owns the land you live on, are you going to plant an orchard? Are you going to plant a vineyard? Okay, I planted a small vineyard, okay? And you just look at it and weed it for years before you get anything, right? No, you're not going to do that because it could be taken away from you. Are you going to build a business? No, because if your land can be taken away, if your business can be taken away, it's not that people don't have an idea, it's that they're acting rationally. When you don't have private property and it can be easily taken away from you, especially if you're a widow or an orphan, then you're stuck in low productivity work. Now, I want to point out, and I won't do this for all of them, but by the way, private property is not a modern Lockean concept for the philosophers in the room. Private property is part of the Jewish and Christian tradition. St. Thomas Aquinas develops it deeply. We find it it's presupposed in the Ten Commandments. You find it in Exodus and laws of restitution. It's in Genesis 23. There's even a question of title. When Abraham is buying a plot of land for his wife Sarah, and they're actually haggling, he's like, no, I want to pay for it to make sure I have the title. It's in Samuel when David, after the plague, and he goes to the threshing floor of Acton of the Jebusite. That's where the Temple Mount is. And he says, here I want to offer up sacrifice to God for his mercy to us. And Acton of the Jebusite, the angel of death, stopped at his threshing floor. He's like, you can have my stuff. I'm here. And David says, no, I will not offer to the Lord something that does not belong to me. Right? And so this deep sense of private property that's connected to human flourishing is not some modern concept. It's part of the Jewish and Christian traditions. And something that's incredibly important to realize with private property is that private property is important not only because it's economically efficient. Private property is important because it is economically efficient. That's data is pretty clear. In fact, I'll show you. That's red, low private property rights, orange, middle, green, high private property rights. See the connection between economic productivity and property? So that part's clear. But there's another part that's really important. And that is, private property is deeply connected to the family and to religious liberty. Why? Because private property creates the space for families to live out their freedom and their responsibility. Now, here's an interesting thing. If you look at Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum, he's talking about private property, and all of a sudden he talks about the family. Why is he talking about the family? Because private property and the family are mutually reinforcing. In fact, there's 3 things that are mutually reinforcing: private property, religion, and the family. Now, one of the ways to understand why this is so important is to look at socialists. Socialists, if this is called the via negativa, socialists think there are 3 primary obstacles to social reform. Do you know what they are? Private property, religion, and, quote, this present form of marriage. Why? Because private property, religion, and marriage, family, are where culture gets passed down. Culture doesn't get passed down primarily in the homily. It gets passed down primarily in the family. So if you want to attack religion, you attack the family and private property. Right? Now this is deep into Catholic social teaching, but many of it, as Catholics, we don't realize it. Private property is a very important thing, even if it weren't economically efficient, because Catholic social teaching is primarily concerned with human flourishing. It just so happens that many of the things that allow for human flourishing also allow for economic development. Right? That's not the end, but it's important. It's an important element. So that's property. The second one is justice in the courts. The Center for Research in India did a study. It takes about 20 years on average to get your court case heard. And sometimes it's very expensive. Right? So if you're poor, if you're a widow, if you're illiterate, you just can't get your court case heard. If your property's stolen, you can't get your court case heard. Now, related to that is a second problem of justice, and that's very relevant for you as entrepreneurs, and that is it's very difficult to register your business. Poor people are locked out of the formal economy. If you had an idea, our host here said she's now an entrepreneur. She started a small business. I love it right away. It's great. You could start a small business tomorrow or within a week at pretty low cost. Well, that's not the same for many poor people around the world. Hernando de Soto did a study in Peru where he's like, I want to find out how long it takes to set up a business. So he got he got 2 little sewing machines and set up a sewing machine shop 5 kilometers outside of Lima. And he got 4 student lawyers to go around, work 6 hours every single day to register their business. They had to follow all the rules and regulations, take public transportation, no air-conditioned white cars. They had to do it exactly like a poor person. Do you know how long it took them to register their business? 289 days. That's 6 hours a day. De Soto said it, the legal systems are simply unfriendly to poor people. In Ghana, it takes 2 weeks to start up, necessary permits 200 days, and cost twice the average level of national income. In some places, it's 10 times the average of national income. That means here, what's the average income? Probably $38,000. You're going to start a business, it's going to take you half a year and cost you $380,000. You're going to start a business? Of course not. So poor people are locked out. They're excluded, right? Again, justice and the rule of law. Where do you think they find their origins? Exodus 23. Leviticus 19:15 forbids partiality. These are deeply part of the Jewish and Christian traditions. And again, let me show you the map here, just to let you know. That is freedom from corruption. If you have corrupt societies are more red, freer ones are green. Notice the United States is not dark green, we're light green, okay? Okay? All right. And that's business freedom. What's those two things I was talking about. All right. And the last thing I want to talk about that's a little bit surprising is free exchange. And this is also important for entrepreneurs. Now, many people are surprised when I say, wait, free exchange. I mean, isn't this a bunch of kind of capitalist rhetoric and everything like this? First of all, I don't use the term capitalism. I use the term a free competitive market economy because there are lots of forms of capitalism. There's crony capitalism and all the things like that. But whatever, I'm happy to use that term if that's what you'd like. But free exchange is really important, and here's why it's important. It's not perfect, but when an economy gets highly regulated, who do you think writes the regulation? Big business, powerful interest groups, and entrenched bureaucracies. And the poorest of the poor lack the political, economic, and social contacts needed to navigate that system. And so they're stuck in low productivity jobs. This is why free exchange is important. Not because it's an ideology, but because it creates access for poor people. Because it lets people build their lives and take care of themselves and not be reliant upon someone else or crushed down by crony capitalism or by bureaucratic socialism. It gives people opportunity to flourish. Now, some people who like free markets think, oh, the market will solve everything. Well, first of all, that's false, because the market won't solve everything, right? I talk a lot about the cultural problems of market economies. Consumerism is a spiritual disease that the market exacerbates, doesn't solve. But for poor people who are excluded and locked out, who all they want to do is start a little business so they can feed their family, free exchange is essential. But in order to have that, you need private property, rule of law, and ability to participate in the formal economy. So these are the fundamental questions that poor people need to address. But unfortunately, most of our focus is thinking about how we're going to engineer them instead of how we can partner with them. And this is where it's business and faith come together. Because think about it, if Catholic business people committed to their faith, committed to the gospel call to care for the poor, they decided, I'm going to become entrepreneurial, not in giving away shoes, but in working with poor people to help them start businesses. Can you imagine what would happen? So sometimes they go, what do I do? What can I do? I would argue that business people with skills and vision and training have some of the best things to offer. But it has to be rooted in charity, which must be rooted in truth. Now, there will always be poverty. There will always be suffering that will require human love, as Benedict XVI reminds us. There will always be a need for almsgiving. There will always be a need to care for the widow and the orphan in their distress. We are called by God to help the poor. We are called by God to be generous, and we must be generous. But we must also remember that for the majority of poor people, the reason they are poor is not because they lack things. It's because they are excluded from justice, and what they need is justice to be able to create prosperity in their own families, in their own communities. And I would argue that our call is not only to be charitable, but to partner with them to help them do that. Thank you for your time.